Hi and welcome. My name is Julianne Koss, and in today's episode of The Complete Picture, we're going to create a composite image, and we're going to use some images that I took in Iceland this past summer. More specifically, if we go to grid view, we're going to use this image here of the ocean. We're going to use an image that I photographed of an iceberg, and then a bird that I also took in the same location, but the bird was flying around the lagoon. But the odd thing is that if you just turned around from the lagoon emptied out right into the ocean. So to me, these images, even though they might seem like they don't go together, they're really tightly woven for me, because it was just a matter really of turning around and you were able to see all three of these images. And that's one of the things that I found fascinating about Iceland, was just that you'd be looking one way at something completely majestic, and you always wanted to turn around because you knew something equally as majestic, if not better, was right behind you. And so what I was really trying to do was kind of bring together these three items that were surrounding me into a single image, into a single moment. So I started by opening these first three images, the ocean and the ice and the bird. And instead of us walking through that, I'm just going to switch over to Photoshop, where I actually have all three of those images, plus the other image down here of the fog, as well as this texture image, already in one document, just so we don't have to waste time doing that. So you can see here that I started off with just a blank document. It's 6 by 6 inches. And then I actually opened each one of these images as a smart object, because I'm not quite sure what size these images should be. And that's really easy to do. Let's scoot back to Lightroom for 1 second. You'll see if you right mouse click and you say edit in, if you just choose open as a smart object in Photoshop, that's how you get your smart object. So don't use the edit in, because that'll just give you a regular layer, but we can open it as a smart object. And then when we're in Photoshop, we have the added flexibility of sizing things down and then resizing them back up. All right, so here's the ocean image. And you can actually see, I see these little dust spots here. Those aren't dust spots, those are birds. So there were birds flying around, just none right in front of me or close by. So let's go ahead and resize this down. So I'll use the keyboard shortcut Command T or Control T, but the image is so big that it's way outside my canvas. So Command 0 or Control 0 will actually resize that down. And I'm not sure exactly what size I want it. So what I might do is I might use a guide to kind of divide up the image into thirds, so that I know to place this kind of in the lower thirds. Because my idea was to show kind of the vastness of the area. I want the ocean relatively small, so I'm going to place that on the bottom third so that the sky and those birds can be put in the top 2/3 of the image. So my rulers aren't showing, but we can use Command R to show the rulers. And then we can just drag down a ruler. And I'm probably going to go to what, like 65, 66%. That's going to basically put my image into the bottom thirds, right? And obviously, if you didn't want to do that, you could position this anywhere you want, but that's kind of a good rule of thumb. And then we'll just resize this down a little bit more until I get the top of the horizon right there at that point. And then we can hit Enter, Return to apply that. And then I'll just zoom in a little bit so we can see what we're doing. Now, you can see, look, I was off a little bit on my guide, but that's not a big deal, right? We can move the guides after the fact, and because this is a smart object, if I wanted to make this a little bit larger, I can go ahead and resize it, and I'm not losing any quality. So another advantage, or the biggest advantage in my opinion, of using the smart objects. Now I can also move this around to reposition it, because I might not like the way that the waves are breaking, and what I really like is right about there. All right, great. Now, I knew that I wanted to composite this with that ice, but here's where I kind of ran into a problem, because I didn't have enough sky. So what I did is I went and found another image that I just knew I was going to use as the fog and kind of the sky here. I just need something back there so that when I put this ice on top of it, it's not just blank. So, well, let me show you what I mean. I'll put the ice on first. So here's the ice. Comes in way too big again. So Command T or Control T. Command or Control 0, and then we'll scoot this down. And what I don't really like, let's zoom in so you can see, I don't really like these bubbles down here. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to rotate the whole thing. We can hold down the Shift key, and that'll help us constrain that. And yeah, I'm still getting those bubbles a little bit, so let's just pull this up. There we go. And let's grab that. I love it. I love the kind of texture that frozen ice is giving me. But obviously we can't see underneath to the ocean below. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to change the blend mode of this layer. We do that by just clicking on the blend mode here that says normal, and then we can select from any of these. So the two that I like the most probably when I'm compositing are overlay and soft light, because what they do is they take the top image and basically they make the lighter, well, they take the top layer and they look at all the layers underneath it, and whichever layer has the lighter value from like 50% gray, it takes the lighter value from whichever two layers, and then it takes the darker value from the dark values of the layers. So basically it's going to add contrast. And if we look at it, we can see that yes, there's the contrast, but see the problem with the sky? That's why I need this other layer here. So let's move this down below. All right, so now look at this great texture, and not only texture, we're getting a little bit of color in here, but we've lost the waves, right? Because this fog with the ocean here is covering up the ocean underneath it. So what I'm going to do, well, we could do two things. We could either drag this layer underneath, or we could leave it where it was. Either way, what I need to do is basically create a mask so that we slowly get rid of one of these layers so that it blends into the other layer. So let's do that on this layer, on the ocean layer. I'm going to use my masks panel and click on the mask icon. I'm going to grab my gradient, G for gradient, right? And then we'll look at our foreground background color. We're going white to black. Where it's white, we can see the information on the layer. So I better start right about here at the horizon and drag up. But I want to stop before I get to the top of the photo, the ocean photo, right? Because I need that graduated area to slowly fade out. If I elongate this gradient all the way to the top, we're going to still see that harsh line. So let's just bring it to right about here. You can hold down the shift key to get it to go straight. And there we go. Now that guide is really annoying. So I'm going to use Command and then a right bracket to just hide that for a minute. Command 0 zooms us in a little bit more. We don't actually need those rulers, so Command R will hide the rulers. And of course, every time I say Command, that's Control on Windows. All right, so kind of like this. I think the ice is just a little bit too strong. I want to fade that back a bit. So let's click on the ice layer, and now we can just use our keyboard shortcuts, our numeric keys. But if I tap like 5 right now, it's going to change the opacity for my gradient tool. So I just tap the V key first to give me the move tool, and then tap the 5 key to screen that back. So that's pretty interesting, because what I'm getting here, you can see I'm getting this texture up here of more water. And you know, I actually kind of like that. And of course, if I didn't, I could screen that back, or I could make this base layer a little bit larger. In fact, watch this. Because this layer is a smart object, if I double click on it, it's going to basically open the contents in Adobe Camera Raw. Well, this is fantastic, because if I go and grab the crop tool, look at what it's telling me. Hey, you cropped this. Well, I know I wanted it a panorama, but because I opened it as a smart object, I still have access to all of that information. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to reset my crop. I tried to drag it up, but what happens is there's a little bit of a rotation on it, so it won't actually let me drag that up. So we'll just clear the crop. I'll click OK, and it's going to redo or re-render that image with a new crop, so that if I wanted to, I could reposition where this mask goes. So I think you can see the advantages of using the smart objects, right? But here's the little tip. If you're going to move that mask, right now, if I was going to use that mask, both the mask and the photograph would move, which might be okay for right now, because look, I'm just going to scoot this up right here. But if I wanted to move them independently, like if I liked where the mask was, don't forget you can unlink the mask from the layer. And that way you can click on either one of these, use your move tool, and move them around again. All right, so that's just kind of a little shortcut there. Don't forget that you can move those independently by simply unlinking them. All right, well, that's looking pretty good. I liked that. But two things happened. One, the base here of my waves got too dark with this overlay of the ice. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to add an adjustment layer that only affects this ocean layer here with the waves. And the way you do that is you select the layer, you go to your adjustments, and in the lower right-hand corner, you turn on your option to clip, so that now when I add my curve, and I make a change to it to lighten it, you can see that it's only affecting the waves. Now it's affecting too much of the waves, but that's okay. I get the front part, this base area down here, the way I like it. And then we can use our gradient tool, just like we did before, to create a mask for the curve adjustment layer. So it will hide and show the curve. Or we could paint it in if we wanted to. There's lots of ways you can do this. But probably the easiest is just with a gradient. And honestly, if you don't want to think about which way to drag the gradient, you can simply click and drag. And if it's the opposite way, look, on the masks panel, you can just invert it. So it's really easy if you accidentally make your mask go the wrong way. Okay, so we're looking pretty good, but to me it looked too blue. Now I like the fact that the ice is blue and that the waves are blue and that it looks cold. But one of the interesting things about this one layer right here, this one that has kind of this fog, is that it does have like a yellowish tint to it. And I liked that. So I kept that in mind when I was looking for another layer. And that other layer that I found was this layer of fibers. And I brought this in, but obviously it's too big. So let's free transform this as well. I'm sure you guys are thinking, wow, you free transform a lot. I think that you'll notice that as you start working with layers, you're going to need to transform a lot of your images in order to get them all to be the correct size in relationship to each other. So anyway, I was keeping in that yellow in mind because I wanted to add a little bit of yellow, I want to add a little bit of purple, and I want to add a little bit of red. And so just by compositing this, by actually setting the blend mode to something like overlay, not only am I getting that texture, but I'm also getting a little bit more color in there. You can see there's before and there's after, especially in the darker areas in that fiber, we're picking up that color. All right, but there's really no central focus here. That's why I need the bird. Plus the birds were just phenomenal. They were so much fun to watch as they would, dive down and catch the fish. So I brought in the bird, and I brought this in as a smart object, and I brought it in as full size for two reasons. One, because I need to mask it, and so I want as much information when I'm masking. And the other reason is I'm not really sure how big I do want it. So let's just option click on the eye icon next to that. And the first thing I'll do is I'll grab my lasso, so L for lasso, and I don't know, this is just a really quick selection, so you guys could use whatever way you'd like to select. I mean, we could go in here with a pen tool if you want to, but for right now I'll just use this, and then I'll make sure that that layer is targeted and click on the mask icon. That way we can zoom in. Let's see, here I am at 100%, that should be good for now. I'll grab my paintbrush, and now we'll just start painting out the image, right? So what we have to do is pay attention to our foreground and background color. Because I'm trying to remove area, I need to paint with black, so I'll tap the X key there, and that will exchange it. Now, I could spend more time on this. We could spend a lot of time if we want, but I don't really want to. So I'm going to make just a small brush here. And how did I do that? I used the right and left bracket key in order to make a smaller brush. And I'm just going to go around here. Now, for me, there are certain ways to paint that are easy and certain brush strokes to make that are much more difficult. And so what I just did there in order to rotate this, because I didn't really want to rotate the image, all I wanted to do was rotate the canvas, is I held down the R key, and that temporarily gave me the rotate canvas. It's this little guy right down here. See this little icon right here? This is the rotate view. Sorry, not rotate canvas. It's the rotate view tool. But when I did it, I just held down the R key, so I temporarily got that tool. And then when I let go of the R key, it took me right back to the brush tool so that I could continue painting. I think that one dark feather there is going to look rather weird. I'm sure there's a name for that dark feather, and I'm sure you guys know it, but I don't. So I'm just doing this really quickly. I would spend more time doing this. Might actually go around with a pen tool. The other thing I've noticed that I'm working with a hard edge brush, and I'm just holding down Control and Option, and if you drag left and right, you can increase the size of your brush. If you drag up and down, you increase the hardness and the softness of your brush. So I was working with a little bit too hard of a brush edge there, but for time, I think you guys can see what I'm doing. All I'm doing is just masking out those areas that I don't want. We're doing it rather quickly. Oops, I just got rid of that. Whoops. All right. Oh, we're okay with that. We're okay because there's probably nothing more boring than for you guys to be watching me paint. So we're almost done. Let me just get this area right there. Okay. Now, if you wanted to, what you could do, I'm going to get rid of that because it's weird. What you could do is you could option click on the actual mask to see the mask, because sometimes you can't really see what you've missed, but In this case, we're doing okay. And then I'll tap the R key this time. I actually tapped it. That gives me the rotate view tool, and then I hit escape, and what that does is it basically removes any rotation. And then Command 0 will zoom us back out. All right, let's go ahead and right mouse click on the eye icon, and what that does is it allows us to show and hide all the other layers. It's already a smart object, so that's great. So when I do a Command T or Control T to transform this down, because I really only need the bird like this big, when I hit Enter Return, it'll go ahead and make that change. Now, the bird is a little bit dark underneath, so I might just go to my adjustments because it's already still clipped. When I add my curve adjustment and I lighten that up a little bit, it's only going to affect the bird. Of course, I don't want to go too far because, right, if the sun is coming down on the ocean, then this side of the bird is going to be shaded. And that was all I did. I added the second bird as well. We won't take the time to do that, but that basically gave me my composite of the objects that I wanted. And then what I did is I just worked on the color a little bit because color is very important and I wanted to accentuate those colors. I also needed to darken down the edges a little bit. And of course, when you use curves, if I were to go here to the top and unclip this, if I add a curves adjustment layer and I add contrast, I bring down the curve and up the curve, you'll notice that not only am I adding contrast, I'm also adding a little bit of saturation. If you didn't want that, you would just set your layer blend mode to luminosity instead, and then you don't get that added saturation. But I actually wanted it in this case. And the other way that I typically will add color is with a gradient overlay. And I was doing this with a gradient layer, but I actually think there's a much better way to do it that's a little bit more interactive. You can access more of the options at one time. So let me just show you this one last little trick with this composite. At the top of my layers palette, I'm going to add a new layer, just a regular blank layer. And then I'm going to fill it. And I don't care what you fill it with. So Shift Delete brings up the fill dialog box. So we can just fill it with, I don't know, let's fill it with a 50% gray. It really doesn't matter what you fill it with. Then what I'm going to do to add my gradient is down here in the effects, the layer effects, which is probably not the most intuitive place to go, but you can go here and go to gradient overlay. Now, before we add this gradient overlay, we need to do one thing. We need to go to the blending options and turn down the fill opacity. That just gets rid of the fill. So there's no more fill in this layer. All we get now is the gradient, exactly what we wanted. But the gradient's blend mode needs to be changed to color because we only want to see the color here. Now, black and white, that's not what we want. So we can click in here to bring up our gradient editor. And here you can see, I've got a few gradients that I've already created. But the nice thing here is that if I were to select a gradient and click OK, it's really easy for me to change the opacity of that gradient. And it's also really easy for me to change the angle of that gradient. It's much easier than when I'm using a gradient fill layer because it's all right here in one place. All right, when I'm finished, or if I want to modify this and maybe add a different overlay instead, all I need to do is select from the different gradients I have or the presets that are there, kind of like that purple one. Click OK. Maybe bring down the opacity a little bit more. Click OK again. And just as a final thing, let's go ahead and we'll add one more curve adjustment layer here. We'll bring down the curve, but I don't actually want to apply that. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to fill this with black, which is going to hide the curve. Grab my paintbrush, get a really, really big soft edge brush, and maybe set my opacity like 20% and just kind of paint with white in this area up here, up at the top, to kind of create a vignette and keep your eye in the image so that it's focusing back down into kind of the bird area and the horizon area. So as you can see, pretty basic compositing techniques. Nothing too outlandishly difficult or tricky. I'm just using multiple layers, using masks with those layers, whether it's a mask to hide or show a horizon or a bird, and then using a few adjustments clipped to specific layers if I just want them to affect one layer or to affect all of the layers underneath, and then kind of a neat little gradient overlay in order to enhance colors on this image. So thank you so much for joining me. My name's Julianne Cost. I hope you'll join me again next time on The Complete Picture.